Hello, everyone.
Hi.
Allow me to start by thanking the organizers of this talk, the people in attendance, and my fellow colleagues on the panel. These are particularly crucial times that we are going through. So these moments where we are able to assemble and organize are equally crucial. In my presentation today, I seek to answer 5 questions. 1. What was living in Syria like? 2. What are the factors that led to the uprising, and how did we revolt? Here, I'm going to focus on the grassroots organizations and the formation of local councils. 3. What were the limitations, and what can we apply for future revolutions? 4. Is Bashar al-Assad a fascist? 5. What is the state of Syria now? So this is my personal testimony. I have spent my formative years living in Syria. To describe it accurately, I would say living in Syria meant living in a state of fear. As young as 10 years old, I knew better than to speak ill of the president, in public or online, and I still carry that hesitation with me today. By the 1990s, the Syrian security forces had almost 70,000 full-time agents and informers. But what you had to really worry about was the secret police. It's been estimated there is one secret police informer or operative for every 50 Syrians, and they could be anything from a cab driver to a trash collector. So we knew our actions were under surveillance, and so our speech was police. We were so wary of showing any signs of political dissent that I believe we had internalized it and became our own police. On the surface, daily life continued. We went to schools, the bakers and banks would open, but beneath it was a stifling political repression. In 1982, under the claim of fighting the Muslim Brotherhood, Hafiz al-Assad and his army killed thousands of innocent Syrians in the city of Hama, in what is known today as the Hama massacre. The operation was meant to serve as a lesson for the rest of the population. Not only that dissent will not be tolerated, but the potential for brutality by the state would be left unmatched. When Bashar al-Assad took office, we had hopes that he was going to be more lenient and more progressive than his father, because he was young and he studied abroad. But that perception soon changed. Here I'm going to go to the second question. What are the factors that led to the uprisings, and how did we revolt? Under Bashar al-Assad's neoliberal policies, crony capitalism had taken full effect, where the state became completely privatized within the ruling family and its own networks. 75% of the economy was monopolized by them. Unemployment rose up by 20% and poverty up to 44%. So it was a political repression. I don't think it's possible to repress people for so long and not expect them to fight back. It was neoliberalism. As the disparity grew, the people in Syria became equally restless. Also during that time, urban areas suffered severe drought, where almost 86% of the livestock died. Water and food were almost non-existent. So actually climate change also played a part in the Syrian conflict. But perhaps what really helped spark the revolution was the realization that it was possible. We watched Tunis raged against their state and we thought, why not? Why not us and why not now? To chant on the streets of Syria demanding the fall of the regime was a visceral moment. Perhaps if we had reasoned or anticipated the possible outcomes, we might not have gone through with it. So protests played a significant role in challenging authority. The regime had spent years cultivating an image of eternal power and dominance, so occupying the streets in protests, song, and dance worked to break this illusion. But in order to establish real change, the dissent had to address the organizational structure in which we function as a society. And this is where the formation of local councils came in. Advocated by our late comrade Omar Aziz, these councils promoted self-governance, horizontal organization, and solidarity with mutual aid by which people could emancipate themselves. I'm going to now walk through a timeline of its construction. By the end of 2011, Ahmed Aziz published a paper calling for the formation of local councils. This paper was circulated among activists and the newly established Syrian National Council. In his paper, Aziz argued that protests alone won't be sufficient to bring about the change we seek. He said that our resistance needs to be infused with our daily human activities. And this is where it started. The aim of the council was to fill in the gaps in the places which were now free of the Assad regime. The first place to establish a local councils was in the suburbs of Damascus. With a few months, it was adopted by major towns and cities. And by 2012, the local councils were recognized as the official form of local government. And they were mostly made up of volunteers or professionals within a specific field. The local councils had four main divisions. It was legal, medical, education, and engineering. So basically, the engineering division would rebuild infrastructure that was broken down. The medical division would turn houses into hospitals and were concerned with health issues. The education divisions worked with teachers and specialists, and this was at a time where we risked a lost generation without education. They mostly conducted themselves with a majority vote, so every 6 months they would vote on who would represent them. They had a deputy in chief and a secretary, I think. And I have to point that this is the first time for free elections to happen in Syria in over 40 years. The funding was mainly established from expatriates in Syria who wanted to help Syrians. People would donate flour or bread or whatever they had. Okay, to give you an example of how they worked. When the Syrian regime bombed the city of Yabrud, expatriates sent the councils around 10,000 liras, that's almost $100,000. The councils would compensate the poorest people in the area, starting with the largest families, and then the rest of the neighborhood. So this ability to coordinate this way really inspired Ahmed Aziz. But what he thought essentially is that these new formed bonds that are based on mutual aid was our way out of the dictatorship. So now to my third question. What were the limitations and what can we apply for future revolutions? First, I can affirm that establishing the local councils, they were committed to democratic ways and transparency. They would show their funding, they would show where the money was being spent. And when this is contrasted by the Assad regime, it becomes evident that alternative ways of living are possible. But that being said, there were some limitations. I've counted 3 so far. First, and this is the most important, it was women's representation. One major limitation in the local council was the representation of women or lack of representation of women. Women have and continue to play a vital and indispensable role in every revolution, and yet their ability for self-determination is often marginalized in larger discourses. Some women helped in establishing the local councils, but in general, their voices were not heard. The lack of representation of women and other minorities reveals a wider range of issues that we need to actively work on dismantling. I'm going to further suggest that we cannot and will not reach the freedom that we are fighting for until we include the emancipation of women and minorities in our struggles. The second limitation has to do with military and religion, because this is somewhat unclear. The nature of the relationship is unclear. Some reports found that military units had influence on the candidates, that they influenced the local councils in a way and had some controls, while other reports suggest that it was separate. It's the same with religion. Some accounts say that they were independent from religion, while others said that there were some religious influences in teaching.
Yeah.
So for future
Yeah, excuse me, Lara, we do thank you for your presentation, but you have only 2 minutes, so please go to the goals. Yeah.
No, it's 10 minutes. She has 5 more. Because we're trying to do 12 to 15.
Yeah, 12 to 15.
Great, okay. I think
Sorry.
four people, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, Lara.
No. So do I continue?
Yeah, you have between 2 and 5 minutes. Okay. Sorry.
So please go on and keep the back.
No, it's just... Sorry, it's fine.
Okay. The third limitation I found was the income. So funding was a problem. The councils did not have a stable source of funding that would allow them to carry out their plans. This was particularly difficult when the regime implemented a surrender or starve strategy. So this is what we need to take in going further: stability, security, and a commitment to human values. You know, what we tried to do in Syria was very difficult, and we were very close, so it does not demotivate me that we were not successful on our first trial to take on a regime that is as powerful and brutal as the Assad regime. And here I'm going to segue to my fourth question. Is Bashar al-Assad a fascist? There are many angles from which we can tackle this question from. It can be measured by the driving level of nationalism and militarism in his campaign. In many of his speeches, Bashar al-Assad will point to heroicism, especially masculine heroicism. He calls on young people to protect the fatherland from those trying to harm it, and suggests that the Syrian men should be ready to die for their country. It could see by his totalitarian rule. As I said before, we haven't had elections in Syria in over 40 years. Bashar al-Assad inherited Syria from his father, and this regime was made out to be an immortal, almost indestructible force that you just had to be loyal to. I remember being in Syria in 2013, and if you would go to the streets, you would just see entire buildings covered with his face, with his image, and it was really something out of an Orwellian novel. Another could be measured by the logic of his brutality. We're talking about mass arrests, torturing and raping prisoners and women, using barrel bombs and chemical weapons, killing more than 500,000 people. But perhaps a significant clue lies in identifying who his supporters across the world are. In the US, former Ku Klux Klan leader David Duke expressed support and admiration to the president on several occasions, even calling him a modern-day hero against demonic forces. 2 years ago, in the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, white supremacists can be seen wearing Bashar al-Assad t-shirts. Other support comes from the National Front, which is a right-wing nationalist party in France, Casa Pound, a neo-fascist party in Italy. It has sent its members to Syria. Golden Dawn, which is a rising neo-Nazi party in Greece, the British National Party, National Rebirth of Poland. So now the question is why? Why are these far-right, ultra-nationalist, neo-fascist parties supporting Bashar al-Assad? With the white nationalists in the States, for example, Assad is seen as a resistance to Israel. So that goes into the whole Jewish conspiracy and into the anti-Semitic trope. There's the Islamophobia, where they think Assad regime fights Islamic extremists. But what I think really attracts these fascists is how Bashar al-Assad describes the society he's trying to build, which is a pure monolithic society of devotees to his own power, which now includes Putin. And Putin plays an important role in this. Alexander Reed Ross said that Assad is central to a realization of Eurasian The idea that Russia will lead the world out of a dark age of imperialism into a rebirth of ethno-states federated under a heterogeneous empire. I hope by identifying what the regime is, we could enable a stricter discourse when discussing Syrian politics. I'm sorry if I'm taking too much time, but this is my final question. So what is the state of Syria now? Well, there are forcible deportations of Syrian refugees from Turkey and Lebanon into war zone areas in Syria. And sometimes these refugees are taken immediately to prison. Syria is now in a state of reconstruction. The economy is in dire shape and millions of people are in need of humanitarian assistance, but the regime is not looking to solve this. Instead, it is enacting laws which would enable it to privatize and capitalize from the current situation. And this is leading to a lot of infighting between the capitalists themselves. I also know there's a Russian influence on the ground in Syria. You can see some products are now in the Russian language. You see Russian soldiers on the ground and Putin's image also occupying the streets. But perhaps most surprisingly and equally impressive is that 8 years in, besieged and under airstrikes, people in Idlib are still protesting and fighting for their right for self-determination. I end this talk by saying that dictatorships have a shelf life and progress cannot be suppressed forever. I think revolutions are an ongoing process, and when I look at the state of Egypt, Sudan, and Iraq right now, I have reason to believe that the next one in Syria is already underway. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Lara. It's really a very comprehensive image of what is going on in Syria, and lots of topics which are really interconnected, and hopefully the discussion will bring out more details about that. Now we'll be moving into the next speaker, and then we'll collect the questions at the end of the seminar. Our next speaker is Javier. Javier actually is combining two majors that are two separate to my mind. He is interested in philosophy at the same time providing health care. He published actually a recent book on Eros and revolution, echoing Marcuse's Eros and civilization. And the book actually is on the philosophy of Herbert Marcuse. And today he will be presenting his talk about the violence in Syria and how it can be conceptualized. So welcome here, and hopefully we'll have a good discussion about it.
Thank you. Okay, so, all right. So I'm going to speak from here. So thank you so kindly, Lara, for your moving and insightful comments. The Syrian revolution, a mass popular revolt against Bashar al-Assad's Ba'athist regime that commenced in March 2011 during the wave of so-called Arab uprisings that began with Mohamed Bouazizi's self-immolation in Tunisia in December 2010, and which now faces utter destruction at the hands of Assad, Russia, Iran, and Turkey, arguably has demonstrated many of the key features of the Eros Effect developed by George Katsiafikas from Herbert Marcuse's metapsychological theory, built in turn on Sigmund Freud's postulations. In this presentation, I will explore some of the myriad ways in which the Syrian people have instituted the Eros Effect during the revolution, and discuss how the Assad regime's democidal counter-revolutionary response, backed by Vladimir Putin, the Islamic Republic of Iran, Hezbollah, and other sectarian Shia militias, international neo-fascist movements, and paradoxically, many Western self-styled leftists, represents a stark example of political Thanatos that recalls the crushing of the Spanish Republic by Franco, Hitler, and Mussolini 80 years ago. Even so, amidst the extreme violence perpetrated not only by the Assad-Putin axis, but also by US imperialism, sectarian rebels, and the Islamic State in Syria during the past 8 years, many leftists have unfortunately endorsed a pseudo-anti-imperialist approach to the Syrian people, whose struggles for emancipation are overlooked. Reflecting on the world's inaction as the regime in Russia devastated eastern Ghouta in 2018, the nurse Birin Hasoun asks, do others actually know we exist? The Syrian communist Yassina Haj Saleh responds in 2018, they don't see us. They don't see our suffering. In Eros and Civilization, Marcuse endorses Freud's stipulation of two primary drives in human beings, the Eros, or life instinct, as against Thanatos, the death instinct. Affirming Freud's postulations about the existence of an interminable conflict between these two instincts, Marcuse applies it to the metapsychological and political levels. For Marcuse, writing in 1968, Thanatos is seen in the neo-colonial slaughter of Vietnam War, whereas the political Eros is found in various struggles for a non-repressive society, such as those of militant students, workers, colonized peoples, and people of color. Alternately, appropriating Erich Fromm's framing, Marcuse distinguishes between the radical character structure, whereby the individual is characterized by a, quote, preponderance of life instincts over the death instinct, end quote, and the affirmative character structure, defined as suffering from a predominance of Thanatos. Marcuse champions rebellions that embody, quote, existential revolts against an obsolete reality principle, in which the whole organism, the very soul of the human being, becomes political, end quote, reflecting the activation of Eros, quote, against organized and socialized destruction, end quote. In this sense, the Syrian revolution provides remarkable illustrations of several of Marcuse's theories. When we think of Fromm and Marcuse's radical character structure in the Syrian context, we can think of its incarnation in the hundreds of thousands of Thuwar, or revolutionaries, who courageously took to the streets in Dera, Douma, Homs, Rastan, Hama, Amuda, and Kamishlo to launch the uprising in March and April 2011. Conversely, the affirmative character structure is typified by the Shabiha, the regime loyalist militias and paramilitaries, Assad and Putin, and their military forces. Indeed, the Syrian revolution provides a stark example of the masses expressing their emancipatory needs, as summarized in the popular slogan, "The people want the downfall of the regime," against the Thanatic power of Assad's bourgeois terror rule, which has taken the lives of over 1 million people, over 500,000 people, and rendered homeless 12 million more. In areas liberated from regime control emerged hundreds of local councils and coordinating committees, as Lara has described. The cause of the local councils, again, as Lara described, was spurred by the Syrian exile anarchist Omar Aziz, who saw a need for the protest-based movement to move towards self-organization through councils so as to collectively collaborate and press forward the revolution. Unfortunately, the Syrian revolution did not see mass industrial strikes or many advances in worker self-management, with the partial exception of the cooperatives and communes established in what is known as Rojava, or more formally, the self-administration of northeastern Syria, following the Assad regime's withdrawal from the region in July 2012. As such, the Tansikiyat, the Arabic translation of these councils, empowered by the Syrian revolution, could not match the historical power of the Soviets and other workers' and peasants' councils in history, in the sense that their power seems to have remained at the political and logistical levels, not including questions of labor, production, and distribution. Still, for all that, the Tansikiyat constituted important experiments in popular self-organization and direct democracy that expressed the politics of the Great Refusal by promoting civil disobedience and rejecting sectarianism. So now to the Eros Effect. Building on Marcuse's avowal of the new sensibility developed through struggle, George Katsiafikas identifies a recurrent Eros Effect in history, defined as, quote, the sudden entry into history of millions of ordinary people who act in solidarity with each other to redirect the world from war to peace, from racism to solidarity, and from patriotism to humanism. According to Katsiafikas, the Eros Effect expresses humanity's instinctual need for freedom. Upon its putative activation, quote, it seems the whole world is transformed, end quote, and humans' interpersonal bonds operate on the basis of love and community as, quote, competition gives way to cooperation, hierarchy to equality, and power to truth. Applying the concept of the Eros Effect to the Syrian revolution, we see that it fits well. How so? For one, of course, the Syrian revolution came within the context of the wave of upsurge known as the Arab uprisings or Arab Spring, which erupted in Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, Oman, Morocco, Libya, and Bahrain beginning in late 2010. In this way, it is similar to the worldwide waves of uprisings from 1848, 1905, 1968, and 1986 to 1992, identified by Katsiafikas as historical examples of the Eros Effect. The Syrian Revolution began with the popular indignation at the Assad regime's imprisonment and torture of teenage boys in the impoverished southern city of Deraa, who had on the night of February 22nd, 2011, painted graffiti on a school wall saying, "Your turn, doctor," alluding to Assad's paradoxical past as an ophthalmologist, as well as "Leave," which is a slogan that had been used against Hosni Mubarak in Egypt. It is clear that the Syrian Revolution has embodied the, quote, massive awakening of the instinctual human need for justice and for freedom, end quote, in its demand for the elimination of the ruling royal junta that has oppressed and terrorized the country for half a century. With the outbreak of protests in Deraa in March 2011, among the defiant parents and local supporters of the imprisoned boys, the prevailing ban on public demonstrations mandated by Assad's emergency laws was broken. The, quote, forms of social control had been ruptured, end quote. In overcoming fear, Syrian protesters became imbued with the spirit of freedom, inspiring them in their ethical and difficult struggle. Civilians would arm themselves and unite with defecting officers and soldiers to self-organize as the Free Syrian Army, dedicating themselves to the defeat of the regime and a democratic transition. Okay, so let me briefly look at some of the criteria of the Eros Effect and how it applies to Syria. One of the criteria is the sudden and synchronous emergence of hundreds of thousands of people occupying public space and the simultaneous appearance of revolts in many places. On March 18, 2011, unprecedented protests broke out in Syria to mark the Friday of Dignity in the cities of Deraa, Damascus, Aleppo, Homs, Latakia, Raqqa, Qamishlo, and Banias. The Assad regime responded to the outbreak of these demonstrations with deadly force. Despite his senior advisor Manaf Tlass's call for conciliation, Assad considered all such protesters to be traitors, akin to the Fighting Vanguard, a splinter group of the Muslim Brotherhood that had led an uprising against the reign of his father Hafez in Hama in 1982. Accordingly, as Lara has described with regards to what happened in Hama, Bashar sought to apply Hafez's Hama manual of extreme violence to the protests, as was evidenced throughout the whole initial phase of the uprising. The ferocity of repression directed at both protesters and the funerals of those killed in the demonstrations, together with Assad's uncompromising and conspiratorial public address on March 30th, only intensified the geographical spread of the uprising and paradoxically pushed it from advocating reform to revolution. On March 25th, the second Friday of Dignity, protesters in Deraa Governorate burned down Ba'ath Party offices and destroyed public images of Bashar and Hafez. Anti-regime protests also broke out in the Kurdish majority Northeast, despite most Kurdish parties' reluctance to support the uprising from the outset. Okay. Now, undoubtedly, the Syrian revolution as a whole has involved the participation of millions of Syrians striving to liberate themselves from the Assad regime. But the utterly brutal response of security forces against demonstrators, reflecting Assad's own authoritarian perspective and the marginalization of Tlass's moderating stance, served to discourage the uptake of the occupation of the squares model in Syria. The third through fifth criteria of the Eros Effect are as follows. The intuitive identification of hundreds of thousands of people with each other, their common belief in new values, suspension of normal daily routines. Joseph Daher remarks on the inclusiveness and pluralism of the Syrian revolutionaries' program in the early years of the uprising, emphasizing the dominant perspective as being for the unity and freedom of the Syrian people and against sectarianism, whether ethnic or religious. Similarly, Al-Hajj Saleh describes the revolution as a collective, quote, experience of self-renewal and social change, end quote, an uprising of Syria's common people against elitism, internal colonialism, and authoritarian modernism. Abu Azam, a poet commander of the Farouk battalions affiliated with the FSA, describes his time fighting in the Baba Amr suburb of Homs as the, quote, happiest time of his life, end quote, for the armed men struggled against the regime in defense of the people. As he says, all of Baba Amr felt like one family. I felt like the warrior poets I'd read about. I was convinced I was working against a tyrannical government that was killing all these people. My duty was to stand with the people who were my family and my friends' families. Yassin Kassab and Al-Shami observe in parallel how, quote, many Syrians speak of their first protest as a moment of personal liberation, end quote. Qassam Eid explains that he felt on fire when seeing the first demonstrations, remarking on the, quote, new purpose that protests had given me, and that I know a lot of young men felt that way too. Okay. Now, let me briefly look at some of the aspects of Thanatos in the Syrian revolution. So despite the courageousness of the masses of Syrians, quote, radically changing themselves while struggling to change their country and emancipate their fellow Syrians, end quote, nearly all of this revolutionary effort has been destroyed in recent years by regime Axis forces. Besides the Kurdish majority Northeast, which is administered as a one-party statelet by the Democratic Union Party, and the northwestern region, including Afrin, which is occupied by Turkey and its affiliated chauvinistic militias, the entire country has now returned to being subjected to Assad's jackboots, with the exception of Idlib province, where regime Axis forces have been pressing a devastating assault for months. The Assad regime has been found to be responsible for 98% of the 336 verifiable chemical weapons attacks perpetrated in the war, and has, quote, consistently prioritized striking population centers as part of an overall war strategy of collective punishment of populations in opposition-held areas. The immediate fate of the Syrian revolution, to be stamped out, is encapsulated in the Shabiha slogan, quote, Assad or we burn the country, end quote. Now the country has burned, and the neo-sultanic Assad presides over its ruins. Like the Spanish Revolution, the Syrian revolution was drowned in blood. Internally, despite the bravery of oppositionist civilians, defectors, and rebels who defied the regime, the neo-bourgeois classes sided with Assad, viewing the regime's opponents with bourgeois coldness as backward peoples and surplus populations whose mass suppression and killing was of little consequence. Beyond the initial repression, rebel communities have been targeted by the Assad regime with indiscriminate artillery shelling, aerial bombardment, Scud missile and chemical weapons attacks, and starvation sieges. Externally, Russia and Iran have provided the regime with billions of dollars in credit before Putin intervened decisively militarily to prevent the regime's collapse in October 2015. And during this time when he intervened, he overwhelmingly targeted FSA positions rather than the Islamic State, as his propaganda suggested. In this way, Putin served Assad's fanatic goal of reducing the Syrian war to a binary choice between himself and the Islamic State. And for its own part, Russia has actually gained by being able to test around 300 different types of weapons on Assad's opponents in Syria. Okay, thank you. Okay, so besides this, of course, we can point to the so-called friends of Syria, the U.S., Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey, as also having responsibility for the failure of the revolution. For one example, many of the aid programs that were given to the rebels were conditional in the sense that they had to be used, the arms and aid had to be used against the Islamic State rather than the regime. We can think also of how Barack Obama failed to observe his red line for the use of chemical weapons following the Al-Ghouta sarin gas massacre of August 2013, which killed over 1,400 people. The reaction to this was to empower the jihadist and sectarian rebels who had been supported by Turkey and Qatar. Under Donald Trump, the US has abandoned all pretense of seeking Assad's ouster, besides highly spectacular attacks following regime chemical weapons attacks in Khan Sheikhoun and Douma in April 2017 and 18. It is clear that Putin and Trump are coordinating over Syria. Beyond this, the revolutionary movement itself was disconcertingly decimated by the regime's devastating reaction, and Salafi jihadists, many of them who actually had been liberated consciously by the Assad regime from the Sethness prison in the first months of the uprising, opportunistically came to dominate the opposition to the regime axis, undermining the revolution's democratic aims. In a sense, we can call this the psychic thermidor of the Syrian revolution. The burgeoning sectarianism of the opposition did cause alienation from the minorities, both religious and ethnic, with regards to the uprising. Okay, now we see that the Turkish president has invaded northeastern Syria east of the Euphrates River, having suddenly been given a green light to do so after negotiating with Trump for the withdrawal of US troops who had been supporting the Syrian Democratic Forces. Considering the brutality of the Turkish military occupation of Afrin since early 2018, as well as its ongoing crimes in occupied North Kurdistan, this newest development ominously raises the specter of widespread war crimes against Syrian Kurds, Assyrians, and other ethnic minorities, as well as the possible forging of an alliance between Assad and the Syrian Democratic Forces against Turkey and its allied militias. The so-called Orwellian Operation Peace Spring has commenced with the aerial and artillery bombardment of civilians. To conclude, so besides the horrendous oppression to which the Syrian people have been subjected by Assad, his ghastly backers, and regional and global authoritarians, including Turkey, the Gulf states, and the US, for over 8 years now, the self-destructiveness of the Syrian revolution itself can be seen in its deviations from the Eros Effect. That is to say, the reintroduction of ethno-religious and class hierarchies, and the opportunistic reification of power on the part of reactionary and sectarian oppositional forces, amidst a marked lack of international support and solidarity for the revolution among progressives and leftists. As such, the fate of the Syrian revolution mirrors that of the Russian and Spanish revolutions. In this light, we can only hope to learn from the past and organize toward a better future. As Hisham and Crabapple observed with reference to the people of Raqqa, summarizing well the meaning of the revolution. Liberators would storm the gates, and residents would place their hopes in the change these new men with guns might bring with them. Liberators would turn oppressors. New liberators would come and do the same. Through it all, they, the residents, would keep, with unreasonable defiance, placing their hope in change. Thank you.
I can now feel how violent it is to be a timekeeper. And this needs some Marcusian analysis, actually. But thank you a lot. You get some sort of a dialectical perception of Eros and Thanatos, and this can be actually open to our discussion. But now we will go to our third speaker. She's Rohini, I think. Rohini is an independent scholar and an activist. She actually is interested in workers' rights and minority rights. Recently, she has published a book entitled Unions and Global Capitalism, Lessons from India. So hopefully this will have a relation to what Lara presented about local councils. So please, Rohini, go ahead and tell us about your presentation. Do you hear us?
Thank you.
Yeah, great.
Thank you. As Javier pointed out, many leftists have failed to support the Syrian revolution, and some even backed Assad's brutal counter-revolution. Unfortunately, the Syrian case is not the first instance where self-professed socialists have supported despotic regimes and imperialist powers. In fact, sections of the left have an inglorious history of doing just this. And it is instructive to look back on this history in order to understand why the Syrian revolutionaries have received so little solidarity from the international left. A revolution can be defined as a mass uprising to overthrow an oppressive regime in which the majority of actors seek to replace it with a regime that is at the very least less oppressive and preferably not oppressive at all. According to this definition, anti-imperialist struggles for national liberation and independence from foreign rule can be seen as revolutionary uprisings, along with struggles against feudal regimes in authoritarian states. By their nature, such uprisings are dominated by the demand for freedom and by expressions of solidarity between different sections of the oppressed population. However, all revolutions face opposition. First and most obviously, the old regime fights back with all the resources at its disposal, including in some cases imperialist allies. But often the uprising includes actors who are fighting against the old oppressive state, but with the goal of installing their own oppressive regime. In some cases, there is the possibility of a compromise, as when the new ruling class, the bourgeoisie, allows the working people to establish a democratic republic, which Marx and Engels saw as the first step in a proletarian revolution. In other cases, as in the case of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, the new would-be rulers are as oppressive as the old regime, and working people are forced into multi-pronged battle against more than one enemy. This is what has happened in Syria, but it has happened before. The Russian revolutionaries of 1917 confronted a brutal counter-revolution by the old regime. They managed to defeat this counter-revolution at huge cost to themselves, but the internal enemy proved to be more powerful. Bolshevik leaders, including Lenin and Trotsky, created the preconditions for this counter-revolution by clamping down on dissent within the party as well as in the Soviets, the institutions of mass democracy thrown up by the revolution, with the massacre of the Kronstadt revolutionaries constituting one of the best-known instances of their authoritarian policies. Even the demand for a constituent assembly to inaugurate a democratic republic, a key demand for over a century which the Bolsheviks too had fought for, was subverted when they found that less than a quarter of the elected representatives to the assembly were Bolsheviks. The assembly was dissolved and a peaceful demonstration in support of it was fired on. As Lenin was to realize later, such policies provided space for the most authoritarian elements in the party to effectively seize power and rebuild the Russian Empire in the guise of the Soviet Union. But by then it was too late. Incapacitated by a series of strokes, he was unable to reverse what was happening. Once Stalin took over the state, freedom was wiped out as dissidents were executed or exiled to gulags. Former colonies were dominated and ruled by Russia again, with genocidal assaults on the populations of Ukraine and the Muslim nations. And solidarity was turned on its head when neighbors were encouraged to inform on neighbors, friends on friends, and family members on other family members. Even after Stalin's alliance with Hitler from August 1939 to June 1941, however, his supporters continued to support him, using the extensive rewriting of history and distortion of the truth employed by the regime. Nor were they the only ones. A large periphery of fellow travelers who identified as socialists saw the Stalinist state as an anti-imperialist one, no matter that it was once again oppressing former Tsarist colonies and exploiting the East European countries that came under its domination after World War II. This is the origin of pseudo-anti-imperialism, opposition to the West in general and support for enemies of the West, no matter how authoritarian and imperialistic they might be. Iran is another example. In 1979, there was a genuine democratic revolution in which the vast majority of the population rose up against the Shah's repressive regime and succeeded in overthrowing it. But in the aftermath of the revolution, Islamists led by Ayatollah Khomeini staged a theocratic counter-revolution that finally crushed all opposition in a huge massacre in June 1981. The Moscow-linked Tudeh party, completely taken in by Khomeini's anti-imperialist rhetoric, supported him until he turned on them in 1983 and slaughtered them. The regime was a far-right one that exterminated all opposition using torture, mutilation, rape, incarceration, and executions, including public hanging and stoning to death. Like Stalin, Khomeini ensured that his critics were pursued around the world and assassinated. Women, workers, students, and ethno-religious minorities saw their rights negated. Iran's Islamic constitution openly proclaimed that they would export their revolution by military means, and they started with the formation of Lebanese Hezbollah, which has since then retained its links to the Iranian regime. The attempt to annex Iraq started during the Iran-Iraq War, which should have ended in June 1982, when Saddam Hussein offered a ceasefire, but continued for 6 more years because Khomeini decided to invade Iraq. His death in 1989 made very little difference to the regime's denial of human rights and democracy, or its regional imperialist ambitions. Paradoxically, the US-UK invasion of Iraq in 2003 and overthrow of Saddam Hussein created space for the Islamic Republic of Iran to move in and entrench itself. And of course, it has played a major role in propping up the brutal regime of Bashar al-Assad, entrenching itself in Syria at the same time. One would have thought that no socialist could support such an extreme right-wing regime, engaged in crushing working people in its own country and abroad. Yet, pseudo-anti-imperialists in organizations like the Stop the War Coalition of Britain have ruled out any criticisms of the Iranian theocracy on the pretext that it opposes the US and Israel. Another shocking example is provided by Bosnia. From 1992 onward, a genocidal Serb nationalism, assisted by an equally fascistic Croat nationalism, was engaged in wiping out all traces of the existence of Bosnian Muslims. Mosques, libraries, museums, manuscript collections, graveyards, birth records, work records, and the people themselves, who were rounded up and put into concentration camps where they were subjected to starvation, torture, mass rape, and mass killings. The neo-fascist character of the Serb nationalists was underscored by the manner in which they treated Serb dissidents, meting out torture and death to them in the same way. And yet a section of the left, including the editors of LM, formerly Living Marxism, and Noam Chomsky's co-author Edward Herman, sided with the Serb supremacist Slobodan Milosevic and Bosnian Serbs carrying out the genocide, like Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladic. By contrast, journalists like Roy Gutman, Holocaust survivors Simon Wiesenthal and Elie Wiesel, and leader of the Warsaw Ghetto resistance, Marek Edelman, saw the resemblance between Serb nationalists and Nazi policies, identified with the victims, and pushed a reluctant Clinton administration and NATO to take action to put an end to the slaughter. There is much to criticize in the Western intervention, but the genocide it halted was incomparably worse. The reason why sections of the left refuse to condemn the actions of the Serb nationalists seems to be that these actions were supported by Russian nationalists on the basis of a shared Orthodox Slavic identity, and they therefore saw it as being anti-imperialist. Incredibly, this outlook has persisted even after Putin came to power, although he makes no pretense of being a Marxist and openly castigates Lenin for advocating the right of Russia's colonies to self-determination. Most disturbingly, it ignores the fact that Putin has created an ultra-authoritarian state that kills journalists like Anna Politkovskaya, opposition politicians like Boris Nemtsov, and human rights defenders like Natalia Estemirova, annexes territory in neighboring countries, as in the case of Crimea, and imposes repressive colonial rule there, and has supported far-right groups and parties throughout the world, especially in Europe, in pursuit of his goal of rebuilding Russia as an imperialist power. It is this allegiance to Putin that accounts for the fact that these neo-Stalinists, as I call them, converge with neo-fascists in their support for Assad. As Lara pointed out, people and parties that admire Assad or have visited him include several far-right ones. I won't repeat her list. All of them are neo-fascists who see their own politics reflected in Assad's ruthless totalitarian regime. Yet at the same time, you find people who are seen to be on the left, figures like Seymour Hersh, Robert Fisk, and Max Blumenthal, supporting Assad by spreading his propaganda. You find the same convergence between the extreme right and people seen to be on the left, like John Tilger, supporting Putin's imperialist annexation of Crimea and oppression of the Crimean Tatars, who had already suffered so grievously under Stalin. Instead of solidarity with the people fighting for freedom and dignity, these pseudo-anti-imperialists support the forces of cruelty and death. In the case of pseudo-anti-imperialists, hatred of the US establishment and its allies far outweighs love for the victims of oppression or solidarity with their struggles. A striking example of this is provided by the way in which they protest vigorously against Israeli attacks on Palestinians, but have never condemned the equally brutal treatment of Palestinians by the Assad regime and its allies: imprisonment, torture, rape, extrajudicial executions, bombing, starvation sieges, and the destruction of Yarmouk refugee camp, described by Palestinian activist Budur Hassan as the capital of the Palestinian diaspora. This exposes these people as caring less about supporting the Palestinian liberation struggle than about opposing the US and Israel. The campaign of vilification against the so-called white helmets, Syrian rescue workers who have saved thousands of lives and lost hundreds of their own in the wake of bombings and poison gas attacks, demonstrates vividly just how inhuman pseudo-anti-imperialism can be. This is the very opposite of genuine solidarity or socialist internationalism. Genuine solidarity entails, in the first place, imagination in order to feel empathy for the victims of oppression, who may be different from oneself, and identification with their struggle for democracy. Secondly, it entails some form of solidarity action, even if it appears to be of little use. In the case of Syria, solidarity begins with listening to Syrian democracy activists and socialist feminists like Lara and amplifying their voices in whatever way we can. If they suggest ways in which we can support their struggle, we need to take these suggestions seriously. Expressing solidarity with them also entails exposing and combating the Assadists and Putinists, vilifying the revolutionaries in every possible way. Terry has been involved in just such a solidarity campaign and will tell us all about it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, many thanks to Rohini for both your presentation and for keeping the time. This really great. We have been realizing that.
Panelists, for your excellent presentations. I'm going to speak about my experience in Minnesota as a Syria solidarity activist for the last 7 years. I was a Nicaragua solidarity activist in the 80s, and we felt we were successful in preventing a US invasion. We had thousands of people across the US in solidarity with the Nicaraguan people, protesting the US Contra war. My Syria solidarity experience has been very different. Even though we're thousands of miles from Syria, our experience here to some extent has reflected the Eros and Thanatos of the revolution. The many courageous, creative, spontaneous acts by revolutionary Syrians, Eros, has moved us and inspired our solidarity work. The crushing of dissent by the Assad regime, Thanatos, has also been reflected in the crushing of anti-Assad views here by a segment of the left. It's been our privilege to be in communication not only with revolutionary Syrians around the world, but to also work with Syria solidarity activists in Ireland, England, Germany, Italy, and the US. They've provided tremendous support for us when segments of the left here have sought to discredit our work. Rohini Hensman has accurately described the pseudo-anti-imperialists who have worked to crush dissent of anti-Assad views. They are West-centric, fail to see that the Syrian people have agency, do not comprehend the complexities of Syrian society, or the internal contradictions of the Syrian revolution. The first Syria events here in Minnesota in 2012 set the stage for the next 7 years. A powerful forum in April by 3 anti-Assad Syrians was smeared as a pro-US intervention event. 6 weeks later, my peace organization, Women Against Military Madness, WAM, held a Syria event at the same venue, an Arab-owned coffee shop, with 3 white Minnesotans who had never been to Syria. And they told us what was really happening in Syria, how the US was behind the uprising, how Assad was like Abraham Lincoln, who had to kill his own people in a civil war. At that time, I was on the board of directors of WAM. It was a highly respected mass organization that was the largest peace organization in the US Midwest. WAM has a decades-long history of opposition to US militarism. For the last 50 years, opposition to US regime change in Vietnam, Central America, Haiti, Iraq, and other countries was the de facto position of US peace organizations. However, Syria is unique. As Lara Kateb has explained, the Syrian revolution was a genuine, spontaneous uprising by the Syrian people, not a CIA operation. But WHAM and other peace groups stuck with the US regime change analysis for Syria. I didn't understand then that a sectarian Stalinist party, Freedom Road Socialist Organization, split from New York Freedom Road, was very influential in WHAM and in the Twin Cities peace movement. Freedom Road and WHAM weren't interested in talking with local Syrians or holding any forums with them. Local Syrians were described as counter-revolutionary expats who were opposed to Assad's socialist government. The assumption was that white anti-imperialists understood better than Syrians what was happening in Syria. It was racist and Orientalist, a pseudo-anti-imperialist position. I'd given support to Freedom Road in 2011 after they'd received grand jury subpoenas for their political work. I organized a large forum for them because I strongly defended their free speech right to meet with other political organizations around the world. Our situation in Minnesota wasn't unique. Stop the War in the UK and Workers' World, US Peace Council, Popular Resistance, Answer, UNAC, and other organizations in the US adamantly promoted Assad's narrative that he was defending his sovereign country from US-backed terrorists. Syria Solidarity New York City activists experienced the same attempts to discredit them that we have. Claims that they are reactionary, warmongering, supporters of US intervention, allies of Al-Qaeda. I was kicked off the board of WHAM in 2013 for my anti-Assad stance. I immediately began working with Syrians on the International Solidarity Hunger Strike for Syria. In 2014, we formed CISPOS, the Committee in Solidarity with the People of Syria, and for our first events, we hosted hunger striker and sarin gas victim Qasem Eid at 2 large forums. So began our organized support of the Syrian people's struggle for freedom and dignity. We had witnessed the Eros Effect, the powerful videos of enormous, exuberant protests, the stories of personal liberation and transformed lives, the films documenting people's courage. We interacted with revolutionary Syrians here in Minnesota and online, and this inspired us. We've worked to build a peace and solidarity movement to oppose Assad's genocidal war. We've organized educational forums, film events, a community Eid, a solidarity potluck with a Somali mosque that had been bombed, a dance benefit, welcome Syrian refugee potlucks, fundraisers for the Syrian American Medical Society, and other events. We participated in worldwide protests for Aleppo, for Idlib, and against bombing Syria. We've made Kafranbel-style banners in response to Kafranbel Syria's banners. We've had 10 non-Syrian Minnesotans volunteer in the Syrian refugee camps and do report back events. We've been an active member of the 45 organization Minnesota Alliance of Peacemakers for the last 3 years. However, the split in the peace movement has hindered our work in the Twin Cities and Syria solidarity work internationally. There are a core group of pseudo-anti-imperialists who see the US as the source of all evil. But there are also many people who just accept their leadership of the peace movement. We've had to reach out to new audiences because the usual peace movement activists mostly won't attend our events. One of the major things we've learned is how tribal even peace activists are. Many people will not defy their tribe to speak out against the genocide in Syria. Personal relationships are at stake. There are more sectarian groups with a pseudo-anti-imperialist stance in New York City. Workers' World, UNAC, International Action Center. Our Syria Solidarity New York City colleagues hold weekly vigils in Union Square in support of the Syrian revolution and in opposition to the genocide of the Syrian people by Assad and Putin. They are regularly shouted at and called names by pseudo-anti-imperialists. A couple incidents have been physical. The pseudo-anti-imperialist Syrian events have been limited by the boundaries of the false regime change narrative. Their speakers on Syria have come from a very narrow roster of people whom they know will promote Assad's version. Their protests are always US hands off Syria. They cannot do any events with local Syrians or Syrian refugees, or recommend any books or films by Syrians, because the information could contradict their analysis. This hegemony, 8 years into the Syrian revolution, still doesn't allow any discussion of the complexities of Syria, and it doesn't inspire anyone. It has a deadening, destructive effect on the peace movement and on the left, a Thanatos effect. The pseudo-anti-imperialists could not have been as successful in swaying the left without the enormous amount of pro-Assad disinformation online. People wouldn't have followed them if there hadn't been so many posts and articles that supported their line. You've all seen the disinformation. There were already articles in May 2011 claiming that Assad was defending his country from US-backed terrorists. From 2011 until now, the propaganda has overwhelmed the truth. Research from the University of Washington found that articles that smeared the white helmets as crisis actors or Al-Qaeda were shared 4 times as often on Twitter as actual news articles. That study also identified an ecosystem of media sites that claim to be independent and alternative, but, quote, their content sharing practices are interconnected with political messaging from Syrian, Russian, and Iranian government-funded media, unquote. Some of the sites they identified as part of that ecosystem were Mint Press News, The Anti-Media, 21st Century Wire, Veterans Today, Consortium News, RT, and Sputnik. Additionally, there are many left writers whose articles have also covered and endorsed Assad's false stories. Robert Fisk, Alexander Coburn, Seymour Hersh, Max Blumenthal, George Galloway, Rania Khalek, et al. We weren't surprised when the University of Washington study was published because we had seen the Syrian disinformation for years. We've been reading and talking with Syrian socialists, communists, anarchists, democracy activists, writers, artists, intellectuals, everyday people, nonviolence activists, nonviolence advocates since 2012, and their information was very different from that promoted by the pseudo-anti-imperialists. Recognizing Syrian disinformation gave us a window into the larger disinformation system. We knew that the web pages and authors who were lying about Syria were not trustworthy sources. In 2016, these same so-called progressive alternative media trashed Clinton, equated Clinton and Trump, and disparaged voting, helping to elect Trump. Since then, these media have refuted Russian interference in the 2016 elections, labeling the Mueller investigation Russiagate and the new McCarthyism. Prominent left writers have dismissed the extensive evidence of Russian interference to also push the Russiagate conspiracy, essentially supporting Trump and Putin's claims of negligible Russian help. Predictably, some of the segment of the left question whether Trump's Ukraine phone call is worthy of impeachment, labeling it Ukrainegate, or just another attempt by the so-called deep state to remove Trump. More clearly than ever, they are supporting Trump's position and demonstrating that they are out of touch with public opinion. After 3 years of Trump's outrageous presidency, the pseudo-anti-imperialists are still equating the Democrats and Republicans. Rage Against the War Machine was planned to be a huge national anti-war, anti-imperialist march in Washington, D.C. on October 12th. They had a long list of endorsers: WHAM, Code Pink, Veterans for Peace, UNAC, Answer, etc. They had organized for months against the bipartisan war machine. They asked people to sign a pledge to not vote in 2020 for any candidate who isn't clearly and vehemently anti-imperialist and anti-war. They got 128 people to sign up on their Facebook event page for this national mass march. And about 100 people showed up yesterday for the march. A march that included Assad's two-star flag and a sign in support of him. Meanwhile, Trump visited Minneapolis 2 days ago. About 20,000 protesters came out on a cold evening with intermittent rain. Comparison of their 100-person mass anti-war DC march with the tens of thousands who protested Trump in Minneapolis could not make it any clearer how the pseudo-anti-imperialists are living in their own propaganda bubble. The crushing of dissent in the peace movement on Syria, their Thanatos, was effective in dominating the conversation on Syria, but not in building a movement. Hopefully, the peace movement can learn from this, that a genuine anti-imperialist, anti-war movement respects and listens to the voices of activists in Syria, Venezuela, Hong Kong, Nicaragua, Lebanon, and other countries, and ignores the propaganda, whether it's from the US, Putin, Assad, Iran, China, whoever, that the truth comes from the activists in their own struggles, not from Western left pundits. The peace movement can only be effective when it's based on facts, on the truth, not on ideology, on solidarity with the oppressed, not with dictators. We will continue our work to build a solidarity movement with the Syrian revolution to oppose Assad's genocide, and we hope that more people will become involved in authentic anti-imperialist organizing. Thank you.